1968 can be seen as the beginning of the end for the Beatles. After Brian Epstein's death in August 1967, the Beatles seemed to be directionless, and Magical Mystery Tour is the representation of that, being their first major flop. However, George Harrison believed he had the solution. You remember when the Beatles met the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi last episode? Well, the original plan had been, after they had completed the weekend retreat for transcendental meditation in Bangor, North Wales, they would go with the Maharishi to study it full-time in Rishikesh, India. But obviously Epstein's death put a halt to that. Now that they were into a new year, George felt that now would be a good time to continue with their studies. So after they recorded their 17th single, Lady Madonna, and its B-side, The Inner Light, the first George Harrison song to be included on a single, the Beatles, along with their wives and Paul McCartney's fiancée Jane Asher, the pair had finally announced their engagement on Christmas 1967, flew to India to the Maharishi's secret ashram in Rishikesh, looking over the river Ganges. But immediately the sense of togetherness and dedication to this new direction wasn't really there since, for one, the Beatles didn't leave together. The Lennons and the Harrisons flew out on the 15th of February, while Paul and Ringo Starr flew out on the 18th. Other famous celebrities were there as well, including Mike Love from the Beach Boys, the actress Mia Farrow and her sister Prudence, and folk singer Donovan. Whilst it was refreshing to get away from the media attention they had endured for so long, and John Lennon's dependency on drugs, the fact is that 3 months of religious tuition, chanting and meditation was going to be tough on the Beatles. Ringo and his wife Maureen were the first to go, lasting only 10 days as they missed their children Zach and Jason, and Ringo couldn't stomach the spicy food any longer. Paul and Jane gave up as well after a month towards the end of March, and then both John and George and their wives left in April. The reason for their departure was due to rumours floating around the ashram that the Maharishi had been making sexual advances towards Mia Farrow and some of the other women, which the actress herself claims never happened. But the one thing that did come out of the India experience was the large collection of songs that had been written between John, Paul, George, and yes, even Ringo. Overall, there were over 30 songs written whilst in India, and naturally there was a desire to get back to England and record them. But not straight away, as the Beatles embarked on what is considered their most unusual venture. In April 1966, Stephen Maltz, the Beatles' accountant, had called the Beatles to his office to give some shocking news. They were all on the point of bankruptcy. Because of the low royalties they received from EMI, Epstein's poor planning to avoid tax, the ridiculous super tax that Harold Wilson had introduced, and the Beatles' own frivolous spending, they had spent over 25% of what they actually earned and had put no money aside for tax. Maltz told them that they had 2 options. They could either pay the inland revenue and declare bankruptcy, or they could invest the £2 million they had left into a business venture. The Beatles chose business. The idea for their company, called Apple Corps Limited, had been devised while Brian Epstein was still alive, and the Beatles believed that he would be the one to run it. But when Epstein died, they decided that they would run the company themselves. John and Paul announced the official opening of Apple on the 14th of May, several months after Apple had started, referring to it as a Western communism, meaning that anyone who wanted to be famous could just submit their ideas to Apple, and Apple would make it a reality without having to rely on men in suits making all the decisions. Alistair Taylor, Epstein's personal assistant, was hired on to be the general manager of the company and appeared on the advertisement for Apple as a one-man band. Immediately, the Apple offices in Baker Street were flooded with songs, book ideas, audition tapes, film ideas, job applications. Anything and everything was sent to them, and the majority of them were completely ignored. One of their first business ventures was the Apple Boutique on 94 Baker Street in London, which opened its doors on the 7th of December 1967. Pete Shotton, John Lennon's old school friend, was hired as manager, and The Fool, a Dutch design collective specializing in psychedelic clothing, were hired to design the clothes and paint the building, having already painted George's bungalow home Kinfauns and John's Rolls Royce. It wasn't long before complaints came in about the artwork, so they had to paint it completely white. Other venues under the Apple brand included Apple Films, Apple Tailoring, Apple Publishing, Apple Records, and Apple Electronics, led by a Greek friend of John's called Yanis Alexis Mardas, or Magic Alex. Out of all the people associated with the Beatles, Magic Alex is the one I grow to hate the more I read about him. He comes across as this egocentric con man who tricked his way into the Beatles' favour, claiming that he had these great technical skills that will revolutionize the world, like car paint that change colour if you snap your fingers, force fields that will protect the Beatles, and wallpaper that had speakers woven into them. He also annoyed George Martin, stating that the new 8-track recording system that EMI had just received was outdated junk, and claiming that he could build a 72-track recording system easily, and the sound will be programmed and recorded through his speaker wallpapers. It's also believed that he was the one who started the rumours about the Maharishi back in India, because he was jealous of the Maharishi getting close to John. Apple Records, headed by Jane Asher's brother Peter, was probably the most successful part of Apple. The Beatles signed on many different artists for Apple Records and actually helped them in getting hits on the radio, whether it be writing their songs or producing them. These included people like Ravi Shankar, Badfinger, Mary Hopkin, Billy Preston, Jackie Lomax, and even the Radha Krishna Temple. But the one thing that the Beatles could not get away from was being the Beatles. Their 3-film contract with United Artists still loomed over them, as they still needed to make one more movie to fulfill the contract, but the Beatles were still not interested. So when they heard that someone would be making an animated feature about the Beatles, they reluctantly gave their blessing to the project and provided songs, as long as they didn't have to actually get involved in the movie. The film would be called Yellow Submarine, based on Ringo's song from Revolver, which had now become a children's classic, as the movie centered on the Beatles, not voiced by any of them, travelling in the titular Yellow Submarine to the world of Pepperland in order to save it from the music-hating Blue Meanies. However, most of the songs the Beatles promised were mostly songs already released, and the 4 new songs were mostly rejected George Harrison songs from the Sgt. Pepper sessions, with the exception of John's Hey Bulldog, which had been recorded around the same time as Lady Madonna, which in recent years has become an underrated Beatles classic. On its release on the 17th of July, Yellow Submarine was a massive success. It was a better representation of the Beatles' psychedelic era than Magical Mystery Tour was, with its minimalistic but variant animation styles made the film stand out amongst the works of Disney at that time. However, it wasn't long before Apple started to go rotten. Due to the Beatles' own naivety over finance, several factors of the company started to go under. The Apple Boutique was the first to go. It never made a profit because everybody was just taking the clothes and walking out. Finally, the Beatles decided that, in their own words, they were fed up with being shopkeepers, and the Apple Boutique closed down on the 31st of July, with the Beatles coming in to take what they wanted the night before letting the public do the same the next day. Apple Books hadn't released a bankable book yet, and a planned adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy series, The Lord of the Rings, in which the Beatles would play the central characters and be directed by Stanley Kubrick of all people, was dropped after Tolkien refused to give them the rights. Many of the employees of Apple, which was now situated at 3 Savile Row, took advantage of the Beatles' generosity and abused it by asking for funding for different and personal projects and just sitting around the offices doing drugs, buying expensive company dinners, and making long-distance telephone calls. It all came to a head at the Christmas party when George Harrison invited the Hells Angels, the notorious biker gang from America, to the Apple offices, where they rode their bikes through the corridors, destroyed property, attacked members of staff rather violently, and stole the Christmas turkey, basically telling everyone to go fuck themselves. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't been talking about the music side of the Beatles this episode. Well, that's just because Apple was taking up so much of their time. Between May and October, the Beatles went back in the studio after deciding that, with so many songs written in India, they should release a double LP. Though in actuality, only 19 of the 30 songs would make it into the final project. But work on this album would be different for one reason. Yes, it's time to talk about her. During their break from each other in late 1966, John had gone to the Indica Gallery in London, in which he became fascinated by some of the avant-garde work of a Japanese artist called Yoko Ono. After this meeting, John had just carried on with his life, but as 1967 came to a close, he couldn't stop thinking about Yoko and had realized that he had fallen in love with her. He even kept in contact with her whilst in India behind Cynthia's back. When Cynthia took their 5-year-old son Julian on holiday in May 1968, John invited Yoko over to his house to work on some experimental tracks, and the two ended up spending the night together. The result of this was the Two Virgins album, released on the 29th of November 1968, a collection of experimental avant-garde noise with its controversial album cover of John and Yoko stark bollock naked. Which, no, I am not going to show you in its entirety, because I don't think YouTube would approve of John's flaccid penis and Yoko's camel toe. When Cynthia came home and found the pair in bed together, she realized it was the end. John and Cynthia's marriage had always been tough, as John was clearly bored of being with Cynthia and frequently ignored his son. But he really did love her, and she believed that he would eventually settle down and be the type of husband that she wanted. But this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and so Cynthia filed for divorce. A lot of fans reacted negatively to the news of John and Cynthia's separation, and they immediately blamed Yoko for it. She couldn't walk down the street without having girls booing and jeering at her and shouting racial slurs. On one occasion, someone had given Yoko a bouquet of yellow roses with the thorns still on them, but John and Yoko misinterpreted this offensive action as a kind gesture, with John saying, "At least there's someone willing to be nice to her." Paul, too, was going through relationship issues as well. Jane Asher publicly dumped him on live television on the 20th of July when she announced that her engagement to him was over because she too had found Paul in bed with another woman. At the news of John and Cynthia's divorce, Paul, who had always got on well with Julian, wrote a song to comfort him during this troubling period. Originally, the song was Hey Jules, but Paul decided to change it to Jude, and so on the 26th of August, Hey Jude was released as the Beatles' 18th single and launched Apple Records. At the time, it was the longest-running single of all time, lasting 7 minutes and 11 seconds, and it soared to number 1 at the charts thanks to the performance on David Frost's show, Frost on Sunday. Since then, Hey Jude is now regarded as the Beatles' most successful song of all time and one of the greatest songs of all time, which makes it a very divided song. Some love it because of the music and the message, but some hate it because they think it's overrated and too long. But even so, no one can resist joining in at the end. John believed that Hey Jude was about him and that Paul was subconsciously telling him to leave his wife and him and be with Yoko. By now, John and Yoko had become inseparable. Now living at 34 Montague Square, a flat that Ringo leased, the pair became active protesters against the Vietnam War and for peace. burying acorns to symbolize that peace, and releasing white balloons into the air with a message inside each one. They also appeared together in the Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Circus film, the last project with the original Stones lineup before Brian Jones's sacking, which many see as the Stones attempting to do Magical Mystery Tour, much like how people saw their Satanic Majesty's Request as a rip-off of Sgt. Pepper. They were even busted together. Remember Sergeant Pilcher? Well, he had finally caught up to the Beatles and had John and Yoko arrested for possession of cannabis on the 18th of October. John pleaded guilty, though he claims the drugs were planted there by Pilcher and his squad, and had to pay a fine of £150, as well as the court case of 20 guineas. Yoko was also present in that most sacred of areas, the studio floor with the Beatles. At the time, this was unheard of, since the Beatles never allowed anyone, with the exception of George Martin, Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, onto the floor while they were working. At first, they just carried on as if nothing had changed, but as the sessions went on, it became clear that John was not going to give Yoko up for the sake of the group. He even had her singing on the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, and her presence just added to the growing tension that was building between them. Now, that doesn't mean that the Beatles never argued with each other up to this point. They did have some disagreements, like any other band, but they'd always managed to work around the situation. Now, though, it seemed like they couldn't reach a mutual agreement. They were now bickering and arguing with each other over songs and compositions, and sometimes it would even be a case of recording in different studios. Paul felt that John's new material, like Revolution 9, was just too weird and harsh for the album, while John hated Paul's stuff like Obladi Oblada, calling it granny music. His songs were still being denied the A-side of singles, which happened again when he wanted Revolution to be the single, but Paul and George Martin rejected it for Hey Jude. George Harrison's frustration with them was due to them still not taking his music seriously, despite his maturity as a songwriter, and Paul's dominant nature over how songs should be. An example being with Hey Jude, George suggested a guitar riff for the middle section, but Paul vetoed it on the spot without even listening to it. It was only when George invited Eric Clapton, who is still one of the greatest guitar players who ever lived, to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps that the rest of the band behaved themselves. This became too much for Ringo, and he announced that he was leaving the band. He felt that they weren't playing as well as a group, and he was feeling isolated from the rest of them, and like George, he couldn't stand Paul telling him how to play his own instrument. He came back 2 weeks later after John, Paul and George reassured him that he was important to the band and found his drum kit decorated with flowers as a welcome home gift. Even George Martin and Jeff Emerick were getting fed up with them. Martin didn't like the idea of the double album and insisted that they should just release a single album, choosing the 14 best songs they've got and focus on them. But the Beatles said no, it was going to stay as a double album, and that was that. Finally, Martin just walked out and Emerick quit. The result of all this was unleashed on the world on the 22nd of November, the 5th anniversary of the release of their second album with the Beatles back in 1963. The album was just called The Beatles, but its most common name is The White Album, as the cover was just a white void, a complete 180 from the colourful spectacle of Sgt. Pepper. People have labelled the White Album as 4 solo albums rolled into one, as it becomes clear that the Beatles were now 4 individual artists with their own ideas that just one band couldn't contain, especially since only 16 of the 30 songs had all 4 Beatles playing together. John's work showcased his new activist stance and hatred of people who were two-faced, like Happiness is a Warm Gun, the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, Sexy Sadie, and Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. But he also showed his softer side as well with Dear Prudence and Julia, his tribute to his mother who had been killed 10 years before. Paul was now the master of crowd-pleasing songs with Martha My Dear, Blackbird and Honey Pie, but was always happy to go back to his rock and roll roots, like with Back in the USSR, Birthday, and Helter Skelter, which many believe is the earliest example of metal. George's songs were spiritual, like the aforementioned While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Long, Long, Long. But he could also be mocking with Piggies and Savoy Truffle. Ringo's Don't Pass Me By, his first solo credit on a Beatles album, is really just a country rock song, but knowing Ringo's interest in country and western music, it does make sense. The White Album is probably the most divided album the Beatles have done. Some say it's their best, it showcases all their different interests and acts as a snippet of what they would later do in their careers, but others feel that it's too long and some of the songs seem like unfinished filler. But it still went to number 1 in the charts. However, the White Album is certainly the band's most controversial album. When Charles Manson ordered his Manson family to murder 7 people, including the actress Sharon Tate, in August 1969, the words that were scrawled in the victims' blood were Helter Skelter and Pigs, as Manson believed that a racial apocalypse was coming after he had heard the White Album. After the album's release, many within the Beatles' inner circle believed that the end was near for the band. But before we get to it, let's break one more time and look at the life of the final piece of the Beatles' puzzle, Ringo Starr.